Great. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Making Sense of Employment Research webinar. My name is Alexa Trolley-Hansen, and I am an occupational therapist and a doctoral student at the Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation at Boston University, and I'm the moderator for today's Making Sense of Employment Research webinar. This webinar is funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research. The webinar content does not represent the views or policies of the funding agency, and you should not assume endorsement by the federal government. The territory on which BU stands is that of the Wampanoag and Massachusetts people, and we honor and respect the history and current efforts of Native Indigenous communities. This webinar is being recorded and closed captioning is on. We ask that you keep yourselves on mute during the presentation, and we are going to have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. You should be able to see a little question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. And if you have a question, you can type that into the box during the presentation, and then I can read it to Dr. Smith, or I can unmute you and let you pose it yourself. Also, we really would appreciate your feedback about this webinar. So at the very end, I'll be posting a survey in the chat. I would like to welcome Dr. Matt Smith, who is presenting research from his article, Virtual Reality Job Interview Training, an enhancement to IPS-supported employment for adults with serious mental illness. Dr. Smith joins us from the University of Michigan, where he is a professor of social work and a licensed social worker. Dr. Smith is the director of an NIH-funded Level Up Employment Skills Simulation Lab. The mission of this lab is to develop and evaluate technology-based intervention to help obtain and sustain employment for people from marginalized and underserved communities. Dr. Smith, welcome. We are so excited to hear from you.
Thanks, Alexa. And hi, everybody. I just wanted to first thank the Boston University Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation for the invitation to speak today at their spring webinar series, Making Sense of Employment Research. You know, I'm really truly delighted to share some of the insights into the research that we've been doing on leading the evaluation of whether virtual reality job interview training has helped enhance employment outcomes for adults with serious mental illness who are engaged in the IPS model of supported employment. Our research is sponsored by grants from the National Institute of Mental Health, and I do have a conflict of interest to declare. My technology partner Submersion, as I will receive a small percentage of royalties on sales of a youth version of the virtual interview training that I'll be talking about today. I'm sorry, I'm not going to be talking about the youth version, but there is a youth version that I receive royalties on. But today I'll be talking about the original version of this tool, which is a commercial product, and I do not receive royalties on the sales of this version. And given this group already has pretty deep experience in employment and rehabilitation, I'm not really sharing anything here on this slide that isn't already pretty well known by our attendees today, but I just wanted to make sure to share a few highlights that really speaks to why research focuses on employment for individuals with serious mental illness. You know, primarily individuals with serious mental illness, they really want to work, and most see work as a key component of recovery. And I think work is also a way to try to stay out of poverty and prevent entry into the disability system. And working contributes to better health and well-being. I just wanted to share a couple of infographics where our main takeaway here is that even though more than 65% of adults with serious mental illness want to work, kind of the national average hovers around 20% in terms of those who with serious mental illness are able to work or have jobs. And we know that roughly 50% of adults with serious mental illness who are engaged in the evidence-based version of supported employment have found employment through that model. And that model is called Individual Placement and Support, or IPS for short. And although 50% employment is a drastic improvement over 20%, more work is still needed to help enhance the ability for these folks to get jobs, because there's still 50% of folks who are engaged in supported employment that aren't getting jobs. And so there's still more work that needs to be done. As many of you here today may know, IPS is a comprehensive model governed by 8 practice principles that include a focus on competitive employment and a rapid job search. Vocational counselors, called employment specialists, are the primary IPS staff working directly with clients to support their access to competitive employment. And overall, the main takeaway here from this slide is that there have been at least 28 randomized controlled trials across several countries that have demonstrated the effectiveness of the IPS model of supported employment, as leading to a more than 2-fold increase in competitive employment for adults with serious mental illness. So given the focus of IPS and rapid job placement, the IPS fidelity framework doesn't necessarily focus on skill development, and in particular, jobs interview skill development. However, we know that the job interview is a gateway to competitive employment for several individuals with serious mental illness who are engaged in IPS services. And although IPS doesn't provide specific evidence-based guidelines for employment specialists to prepare their clients for job interviews, I do know the IPS Employment Center does provide some resources for job interview training. And in our recent study, data collected from employment specialists suggested that they practice job interview role plays with about 50% of their clients. And so it's still happening to basically a majority of folks engaged in IPS. And notably, the typical job interview role play preparation includes 1 to 2 mock job interviews prior to a real life interview. And typically the model is, hey, I have a real world job interview coming up. Can we do some role playing so I can get ready for it? And typically clients do that one or 2 times because it's resource intensive. It takes a lot of time to engage in role play training. And as you can imagine, though, just 1 to 2 practice interviews, it'd probably be quite difficult to build a sustainable skill with such minimal practice. I tend to use an analogy with an instrument. And so when you learn to play a musical instrument, you have to practice and practice and practice to build a set of skills to play an instrument. But if you pick up a guitar and play it once or twice, are you really going to build that skill on how to play a song? And when it comes to the job interview, it's sort of a symphony of social skills. And so you do need quite a bit of practice to perform as well as you would like. And so despite a history of mock interview role plays as a method to prepare adults with serious mental illness for interviews, there's no data to really support mock interview training as an effective approach. And so this suggests there's a lack of evidence-based job interview training and a major gap in services. And so to address this gap, I partnered with Morris Bell from Yale School of Medicine and a small tech company called Submersion back in 2012, where we partnered together to develop and then begin evaluating what we call virtual reality job interview training as a computerized job interview simulator in order to meet the needs of adults with serious mental illness who are trying to get a job. Trainees log into the job interview simulator through a website, and they practice interviews with a virtual hiring manager named Molly Porter, who she's here on the screen. And she works for a fictional company called WonderSmart. And Molly is a human avatar that was created by recording thousands of brief video clips with an actress, and then an AI algorithm blends the clips together to create an immersive experience where trainees repeatedly interview with Molly. And during each of these interviews, they receive 4 levels of feedback on their interview performance. And we'll share a little bit more about those different levels of feedback. And they're working towards improving on 8 different job interview skills. And when Molly talks to you, she fills up the full screen, kind of like in a Zoom conversation. And then when it's your turn to speak, the technology transitions the website into this interface where trainees read through 10 to 15 statements written at a 6th grade reading level. And they range from very helpful to your rapport with Molly to very hurtful to your rapport with Molly, and anywhere in between. And typically the interviews with Molly take 20 to 25 minutes, but sometimes they can take a bit longer. It just depends on how quickly somebody reads and how much time they take weighing the different options. And I'd like to point out a couple of features that we'll introduce later, but in Molly's corner of the screen is a job coach in the bottom right corner wearing a pink sweater. And the job coach actually gives you real-time feedback on what you say. And as you select these statements, there's a little microphone in the top right corner of Molly's screen, all the way in the far right next to what they call a hamburger menu, the 3 horizontal lines. And you turn on that microphone and you basically read these statements out loud. And then the speech recognition component that you turn on with this microphone will listen to you and then facilitate Molly's response or her next question after you give your response. In addition, there's a green button towards the top in the middle of the screen that says transcript. And so this transcript button allows you to access a real-time transcript as well as a transcript of your responses and Molly's questions throughout the course of the interview. Most of the time we advise our participants to use this feature at the end. And so that will keep a running tab of the entire conversation. And then below Molly's screen is another transcript window that will just give you the last 2 exchanges with Molly. And so before you interview with Molly, you actually get to fill out and practice an online job application, which provides clients with skills to go on and fill out online job applications, which is becoming more of the norm. And then Molly actually uses the information from the job application that you complete. Here's an example of that.
I see from your application that you're interested in customer service. Have you worked in customer service in the past?
And that's just an example of how the job interview or the application informs the direction of the job interview. Just moving to the next slide. And then Molly also has different personalities across easy, medium, and hard levels of difficulty that result in a matrix of 9 different mood states where Molly can be friendly and helpful or inappropriate and mean. And this variation of personality was designed to present trainees with random versions of Molly, so they kind of never know what version of Molly they're going to get to practice with. Just like in the real world, you never kind of know the mood of the hiring manager. You could be the first interview of the day or the 10th interview of the day. And it's really hard for those hiring managers to kind of keep that stability in how they conduct the interview. So we're going to see a couple of versions of Molly here.
Hello, thanks for coming in. My name's Molly. What can you tell me about yourself?
So that's friendly Molly, and then we have the business version of Molly.
My name's Molly Porter. We spoke on the phone. I'll be conducting your interview today. I have many people to interview today, so let's get down to business.
And then here's the screen just to review some of the job interview skills that you get to learn about before you practice with Molly. So on the front end, before you begin your training with Molly, you're going to learn more about during the job interview, it's important to come across as a dependable employee, someone who's professional, someone who maintains a positive attitude, as just a few of the skills that you're going to be learning about. And then I mentioned there's 4 levels of performance feedback. As I mentioned, there's real-time feedback from the job coach. And then the second level of feedback is a transcript review where your responses are color-coded in red light, green light. So red font is where you may have said something that's hurtful to your rapport with Molly. And something in green font is where you said something that's helpful to your rapport with Molly. And then the level 3 feedback is you get a summary level of review on each of the 8 job interview skills that you're practicing during the course of the interview. And then the final level of feedback is a numerical score. And then the numerical score actually helps you progress through the easy, medium, and hard levels of the interview. And so after we completed our design with Molly, we were funded by NIMH to conduct 3 randomized controlled trials to begin studying the lab-based efficacy of Molly when evaluating the tool in different groups. And then we were awarded some additional funding to complete 2 additional RCTs. And altogether, we did our lab-based RCTs to evaluate the effects of practicing with Molly in a cohort of adults with schizophrenia, mood disorders, veterans with PTSD, young adults with autism, and adults with a history of substance abuse. And to evaluate whether practicing interviews with Molly led to improved interview performance and access to jobs within a 6-month follow-up. And all participants in these lab-based efficacy trials were actively seeking employment, and they responded to community advertisements to participate in the research. And so across the 5 trials, participants completed 2 job interview role plays at pre-test and 2 more at post-test that were video recorded and rated by master's level coders with prior employment as hiring managers. And then those coders were masked to study condition. And what we see here is that interviewing with Molly was associated with improved job interview skills as compared to the control group between pre-test and post-test. And across these 5 samples, only about 30% in each group were actively engaged in vocational rehabilitation services. And then in terms of our 6-month follow-up data, that revealed that participants who practiced their interview skills with Molly were more likely to receive offers for competitive jobs by 6-month follow-up. And then what we did is we leveraged the results of these 5 efficacy trials to obtain funding from NIMH to evaluate whether adding the Molly tool, and we call it, I mean, the name is virtual reality job interview training, which is sort of a mouthful. And so during presentations and just kind of informally, we just refer to the tool as the Molly training or Molly. So you'll frequently hear me just talk about Molly as a person, but it's also, you know, it's kind of the nickname for the tool because she's the star of the show. And so we evaluated whether adding Molly to high fidelity IPS services led to stronger employment outcomes. And concurrently, we also conducted an initial multi-level mixed methods implementation process evaluation to study the feasibility of implementing Molly within IPS, as well as assessing Molly's acceptability, usability, and appropriateness for integration within IPS. Our effectiveness evaluation focused on employment, including both employment rate and time to employment. And then our secondary outcomes were focused on job interview skills, job interview self-confidence, and job interviewing anxiety. And then to conduct this study, we partnered with the largest IPS provider in Illinois, which is at Thresholds in Chicago. And so in terms of implementing Molly within IPS, we initially created a geographically centralized computer lab at one of Threshold's main buildings, where employment specialists delivered Molly, but it turns out transportation to this location was a critical barrier to engaging in the study and using the intervention. And so we dropped this approach, and then we implemented Molly at neighborhood satellite locations where clients typically receive their service. And that centralized computer lab approach was brainstormed by our community advisory board that had a whole lot of folks with lived experience and service provider experience, scientific experience, and we all thought that was a really good idea, and it just didn't work because of these transportation barriers. And so we dropped that approach within a month or 2 after starting the trial and shifted to what we call the mobile Molly delivery, which is taking a laptop out into the community, just like ESs typically provide services, meeting clients where they are at. And so based on the efficacy research, we recommended participants complete at least 15 interviews with Molly, 5 at easy, 5 at medium, and 5 at hard. But compliance and progress was individualized. And what I mean by that is participants could determine when they were sort of done. You know, what we recommended that they did was these 15, because that's what we saw in the efficacy, but we wanted to kind of train folks on how to use the tool and allow them to use the tool and kind of monitor their progress. And so we thought this design would really remain in the spirit of high fidelity IPS with the focus on rapid access to employment. So participants wouldn't, quote unquote, wait to finish their Molly training before they started interviewing for a job. And so there was no, hey, you can't look for a job until you finish Molly training. Like it was, you know, within that IPS spirit of making sure folks are trying to fast track to get that job. So overall, the implementation took an average of 8 weeks to complete. And what we saw was that in this trial, we had a 3-to-2 randomization scheme based on some low recruitment and some other things. But we had 54 people randomized to receive Molly, and then 36 randomized to receive IPS as usual. And so in terms of the IPS plus Molly group, out of the 54 that were randomized, 48 showed up at least once. The other 6 never actually showed up for another, they never met Molly, they never were introduced to it. But this was an intent to treat design, so we made sure to include them in all of our analyses. And so we found that these participants completed about 9 interviews with Molly out of 15. They completed 3 at easy, 3 at medium, and 3 at hard on average. They spent about 3 hours in conversation with Molly, and they spent about 15 minutes going through the e-learning curriculum that I really just glossed over at the beginning. But there's an entire e-learning curriculum that provides tips and advice on the job interview process, as well as goes over those 8 job interview skills. So that 15 minutes is basically enough time for folks to see what those 8 skills are, read about them, and then they just were more interested in practicing with Molly. And then during that same period of time, the IPS as usual group completed about 2 mock interviews that lasted about 24 minutes on average. And we were able to collect that data from employment specialists. So throughout the implementation of the study, employment specialists every other week were filling out meeting reports. And so it was almost every time you met with a client, you filled out a report that provided information on what sort of services as usual as it related to job interview training. Along those lines, the clients discussed the job interview training in general. In the IPS as usual group, about 69% of clients discussed their interview skills with their ESs for about 33 minutes. And then the Molly group, about 65% of the Molly group discussed interview skills for about 35 minutes. And so those were quite similar between the 2 groups. They didn't differ statistically. And then one thing we didn't anticipate was a natural integration of Molly within IPS. And so about 60% of the Molly group actually talked about the Molly training with their employment specialist. And that's something we didn't require and just kind of let it play out naturally. And that's kind of what we found. And so all that being said, does practicing with Molly enhance outcomes for clients engaged in high fidelity IPS? And so here in table 1, I just want to report on some of the participant background characteristics. And largely, we did not see any differences between groups in terms of age, sex assigned at birth, race, education level, their employment over the past 2 years, or their days in IPS at baseline. And even though there wasn't really a statistical difference between groups in days in IPS at baseline, we do note that there was about 2 months difference. And that qualitatively could still have somewhat of an impact. I mean, we didn't really see much, but you know, it could. And then here in table 2, we did not see any differences between groups with respect to their clinical and cognitive functioning or in terms of diagnosis. And so largely what this means is that the randomization of the study held. We did not see these group differences. So one other hurdle we faced, as I sprinkled in as a kind of a seed earlier, is that we faced low enrollment during the study for a few months. And so during that time, we kind of slowed down enrollment in a lab-based setting, and then we had to redesign and then launch enrollment in a new way. And so that just kind of slowed down our recruitment. And so at the beginning of the study, we were actually only enrolling folks who were brand new to IPS. And as part of trying to boost enrollment numbers, we opened up recruitment to anybody that's currently in IPS. So you didn't have to be brand new. And so what ended up happening is our sample was pretty evenly split between participants who were recently enrolled in IPS, which was defined as within 90 days, and participants who were defined as non-responsive to IPS, which was defined as greater than 90 days in IPS with either no job or they got a job and lost a job pretty quickly. And that definition comes from some of the work that Susan McGurk has done. And so that being said, our primary intent to treat outcome, what we see is that the employment rate by 9-month post-randomization was 43% in the IPS plus Molly group and 28% in the IPS as usual group. This did not obtain statistical significance. Our total sample was about 90, and we were powered to enroll 160 participants. And we basically lost a year and a half due to the start of the COVID pandemic. And so around the start of the pandemic, we tried to wait it out as many people did. And once it became apparent it wasn't going to change during the timeline for the study, we had to kind of draw a line in the sand and stop enrollment and such. And so the primary underpowered result, without covariates, suggested a trend, but it wasn't significant. But we also note that the IPS as usual rate of 28% was lower than expected, given that 49% of the sample were already classified as IPS non-responders who do not typically get jobs during their IPS tenure. And that being said, we did, during the course of peer review, we went through a process of adding covariates to our model. And when accounting for covariates that were both theoretically and in our data set empirically related to the employment outcome, the top table highlights that the intent to treat IPS plus Molly group had an odds ratio of 3 in terms of a greater likelihood of obtaining employment within that 9-month time frame as compared to the IPS usual group. So we do see this effect of an odds ratio of about 3.0 improvement in terms of access to employment. And then the bottom table highlights that the IPS plus Molly group, the IPS plus Molly group had a shorter time to employment at a trend level in a Cox proportional hazard model, but that did not obtain statistical significance, even adding those same covariates that were theoretically and empirically related to the employment outcome. In terms of our post hoc outcomes, knowing we had a significant proportion of our sample who are IPS non-responders as compared to recent IPS enrollees, we looked at these groups separately. And overall, we see a large significant difference among IPS non-responders who practice with Molly versus those who did not. So for those IPS non-responders who practice with Molly, they were employed at 52% by 9-month follow-up, compared to 19% of IPS non-responders by, within that same time frame, which was statistically significant. And then when we model it with the same covariates from that were identified in the last slide, we do see an odds ratio approaching 6 in terms of the access to employment for this logistic regression. And then meanwhile, when we look at recent IPS enrollees, we did not see a difference between groups. And so for somebody that was brand new to IPS, asking them to practice with Molly did not show us any sort of difference between the groups in both the logistic regression model as well as just the straight chi-square analysis, where we see 35 to 40% in the two groups, which was non-significant. And then regarding our time to employment analyses, the top table highlights that analysis among the IPS non-responders. The Molly group was more likely to get jobs sooner. Meanwhile, the time to employment did not differ between the two recent IPS enrollee groups. And then I have a nice visual of that finding. So this figure gives a visual representation that the IPS plus Molly group among IPS non-responders had a greater likelihood of getting a job sooner than the IPS as usual group, as we saw in the table from the last slide. And what we see here is that these paths for the hazard ratio actually begin to diverge around day 60, so about 8 weeks. And what we know is that it took about 8 weeks to complete the Molly training. And so what we see here is that those two findings in a way sort of align, that it took 8 weeks to complete the training, and that's about the time the hazard ratio diverges from these two groups in terms of their likelihood for getting employment sooner. And so for our secondary outcomes, we observed multiple significant group by time interactions in the entire sample from a series of mixed effects models. And this suggests that IPS plus Molly had significant improvements in interview skills, self-confidence, and job interview anxiety as compared to the IPS as usual group. However, I do note that the finding for job interview anxiety, in theory, that could be a regression to the mean, because we do see that the Molly group has started off with a higher level of job interview anxiety. So concurrently with our effectiveness trial, we conducted this mixed methods multi-level implementation evaluation where we had focus groups and interviews with clients, employment specialists, team leaders, and program directors. And our quantitative results displayed here suggest that the perception of Molly as being highly acceptable, appropriate, and feasible to implement. And that perceptions was shared by IPS staff. And so we had 13 staff across ESs, TLs, and the directors. And we see both the mean. I just reported the mean here on the slide along with the total maximum score possible. And so then when looking at the survey results from the clients, we had 42 complete the survey on acceptability and then usability, which was, I believe, just a single item around, in the future, can you use Molly independently? And so, we had a means that reflected a strong response to those surveys as highly acceptable and usable. Our qualitative analysis was adjusted from focus groups to one-to-one interviews due to the pandemic. So I just wanted to highlight that. So we conducted focus groups with 8 employment specialists and interviews with 3 ESs, 3 TLs, and 3 IPS program directors, and 3 Molly implementers. And so and sorry if I glazed over this earlier, when we moved from that lab model, we had trained employment specialists to do the delivery in that lab model. And then when we switched to moving the Molly delivery out into the community, we had to save as much time as possible. And instead of taking months to figure it out, because we had to keep the study moving, we switched to thresholds local research staff. So we trained them to provide the delivery out in the community. And so we had those 3 implementers interview about what that experience was like for them. And so we analyzed the qualitative data using the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, which is a standard implementation framework in the field of implementation science. Some notable highlights are that the employment specialists reported Molly provided them with what's called relative advantage over their usual practices, as Molly could give their clients more direct and unfiltered feedback that challenged their clients. This was notable as some of the employment specialists, reported to us that they kind of felt that, they had to sugarcoat some of their feedback to clients to kind of walk that fine line so they didn't upset clients with being too direct. However, Molly was able to provide that direct feedback. And so they felt that that was pretty helpful over what they could do. And then employment specialists also noted that the one-to-one meetings with their clients were actually more productive for because what ended up happening is clients came ready to discuss their interview skills during that meeting with their ES. So they practiced with Molly, kind of identified what they did well, what they didn't do as well, and then they brought that to their employment specialist and said, hey, I didn't do so well here, can we work on this? And so it kind of made it a more targeted meeting and more productive. And then our other qualitative results reflected that Molly required some adaptation, including more in-depth training for employment specialists on troubleshooting any potential internet connectivity issues or glitches that could arise. Regarding potential barriers to delivery, the use of public transportation could detract clients from wanting to attend multiple visits in person, which became more feasible after we concluded the trial. Because of the coronavirus pandemic, we actually piloted a hybrid remote delivery strategy, which actually worked really well, where employment specialists had a one-to-one meeting to teach their clients how to practice with Molly. And then the clients were actually able to use a device at home the rest of the time with some phone support from an ES, and that actually worked pretty well. So that was a feasible approach. And then other barriers were that implementers needed more appropriate training to navigate some of the symptom-related challenges that could interfere with Molly engagement. Excuse me. And then, so just wanted to share some of the highlights here. So in terms of relative advantage, these are just, again, some themes from the perspective of clients that were corroborated by staff. Improvements in self-confidence in the job-seeking process, increased motivation to find work, improved comfort with the job-seeking process, and it simulated an interview for someone who has never had a job. So I don't remember the numbers offhand, but there was a pretty decent percentage, I think at least 15 to 20% of clients that had never even had a job before. And so part of their fear of going on a job interview was they've never had one, they didn't know what it was like, and they didn't know what to do. And then practice with Molly kind of provided them with that exposure therapy where they became comfortable with what that experience would be like. And then here's just a quote about that relative advantage. So it's like everything went together, the Molly study, and then prepping for that, through that, them meeting with me, and then boom, now we're meeting with the employer. Now it's time to really shine. So Molly really helped me to be more efficient with spending more time focusing on the job development piece. In terms of adaptability, so implementers need working knowledge for tech troubleshooting. And so this is a quote from one of the implementers. I would say for most members at Thresholds, they refer to their clients as members. It was pretty much just setting up the program and just really basic computer skills a lot of people didn't have. So most of the time they spent supporting a client was, okay, we're going to set you up with using the computer, and then you can go on from there and work on your own. And so I feel like we intervened the most with literally just logging in, or if a pop-up came up on a screen, people would kind of freak out and stop doing the interview. So that probably happened the most often. So there's a tip box that can come up on during your interview with Molly. And it's something that some people like and some people don't like. And if you can turn it off if you don't like it. And so sometimes that would pop up and folks would close it, but you can go into the options and turn it off completely. So that's just contextualizing some of those tech things that can come up where better training would be necessary. So in addition to some of our implementation evaluation results, we also conducted a qualitative analysis of the client's Molly experience beyond implementation feasibility. And so we captured some of this through, from 3 focus groups and 3 semi-structured interviews with clients, as well as interviews with 11 employment specialists and 2 focus groups with 11 employment specialists. So practicing virtual interviews improved client connection to job seeking, IPS engagement, interview skills, comfort, confidence, and motivation. So just wanted to highlight some of these themes that were generated by our qualitative analyses. And then we also, in a separate but related study, we also trained peer support specialists to implement Molly. And then we interviewed them regarding the feasibility of integrating Molly into their practice as a peer. And so what we learned from that was that peers want, first and foremost, peers want to support vocational services, and they feel they can play a larger role than what they're playing. And peers viewed Molly as something that was acceptable to them as a practice for voc services, feasible for them to deliver. And they felt like they could provide a higher level of service because they're uniquely qualified through their lived experiences, having gone through job interviews themselves and being able to contextualize that lived experience for clients in IPS. So in terms of some take-home points, when adding Molly to high fidelity IPS, especially for those who were IPS non-responders, we had greater odds of getting a job by 9 months post-randomization. We had observed a shorter time to employment. Among all study participants who practiced with Molly, we noted there were improved job interview skills, anxiety, and confidence. And then some additional take-home points. Molly is perceived as highly acceptable by clients and staff. Molly offered multiple advantages within the context of IPS, though the implementation of Molly would require some adaptation, such as staff training and contextualization. And implementation barriers included using public transportation that could be overcome with potentially a hybrid delivery model. In terms of what's next, our first follow-up study will focus on comparing, we hope our next study will focus on comparing the effectiveness and implementation process outcomes between two strategies to deliver Molly for IPS non-responders. First, using employment specialists, and then using peer support specialists. And we're still trying to get this study funded, and we're excited to have Sally Rogers, Kim User, and Susan McGurk, who are all from the BU Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation, as part of our team. And currently we are focused on recruiting enough sites to power this study, as we'll need about 50 IPS programs. So we're, we submitted this grant once and had pretty good feedback from our grant reviews, and are just being very strategic about when we want to resubmit and making sure we have enough partners for that resubmission. And then another future project that I'd like to highlight, which is pretty cool, is we recently developed an innovative new simulation using kind of the same technology, where we partnered with the autism community to create a new intervention called Work Chat, a virtual workday, where trainees practice conversations with customers, coworkers, and supervisors in an effort to help sustain their jobs once they get the job. So that social environment after somebody gets a job, is one of the factors of leaving a job. And so this was something that we heard loud and clear from the autism community. And I bring this up as I know that it could possibly be another intervention to evaluate within the mental health community. And so I'm excited to just kind of share this as an idea for some of our future projects that we're going to look to pilot this type of intervention within supported employment as well. And I thought that would be pretty neat to share today. But it uses that same kind of technology to provide you with that practice on talking with customers, coworkers, and supervisors. So you get kind of the 4 levels of feedback, and you actually get a virtual workday environment to kind of move around and complete some work tasks. But that being said, I want to make sure to acknowledge that this project had a lot of moving pieces and required me to build a community of 70 researchers and employment program staff and administrators to complete the project. And I, of course, want to make sure to acknowledge the contributions of our study participants, as well as Lisa Rosano from Thresholds and Susan McGurk and Kim User from here at BU, who without their help, they were instrumental in helping me kind of learn how to do research within IPS-supported employment. And I can't thank them enough for their contributions to the project. So that being said, I just wanted to thank everybody for their attention, and I'm happy to answer questions, or, if you're interested in future demonstrations of what the tool is or want to share this with your group, I have my contact information below. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Smith. We do have a few questions. One of the first questions is, would you be willing to share some of these slides? And if so, what would be the best way for them to reach out to you? Would be via this email?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, so these slides are on Google Slides, and I'm happy to share a public link to them. That's not a problem. So feel free to email me directly at my email address, mattjsmi@umich.edu.
And then we thank you so much. We do have a few questions. I'm going to unmute people in order that the questions came in. So the first person that would like to ask a question is Regina Kaiser. So Regina, I'm allowing you to talk if you would like to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Good morning. Thank you for this presentation. Very exciting.
Sure.
We are an IPS service provider in the state of California.
Okay.
And so I would definitely like more information of how we can participate, how we can use this for our program. What is that process?
Sure, it's a great question. And I inevitably, I kind of get a similar question every presentation. And so typically, in order to get access to the tool and to pilot it, I can do what's called a kind of a warm handoff. And if you reach out to me over email, I can connect you to the submersion group. And then you can have a conversation with them about the potential of piloting this tool within your agency. I know that in the state of Illinois, any agency that uses this tool, Illinois Voc Rehab will reimburse that agency for the costs of the tool. But this research kind of emerged from Illinois. The fidelity reviewer for IPS in Illinois attended my very first presentation before I even conducted a study. So we were literally trying to recruit participants, and my very first recruitment presentation he attended, and he's been a staunch advocate even before we had data. So he really was a champion at the state level and kind of made that happen. But feel free to email me if you're wanting to pilot it. If you want to participate in the research, that's the same thing. Just feel free to email me. And the thing is that real life always moves faster than research. So if you don't want to wait around for the research to help pay for your access to the tool, feel free to, connect with Submersion. And I didn't share the data, but it is a pretty inexpensive tool to get up and running. We actually published a study on the costs of the labor costs translated into dollars. But typically it doesn't cost that much to get it up and running at your agency, but it does take a commitment to kind of figure out how that looks, and does take time to do that. But feel free to reach out to me and I can share more information.
Great, thank you. I'll definitely do that.
Sure.
All right, next, thank you so much, is Naim Menez. I'm allowing you to speak. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Good afternoon. I was just wondering about, in terms of the training for the employment specialists, if you could maybe go over a little bit about what that looked like. Was it
Sure.
a more technical training on using the system, setting them up, or did it affect the specific content and how they were debriefing with the clients when they would come out of the simulation? I'm also curious about if the participants were in sort of a private space when they were doing the simulation, or if the specialist was there listening to their responses as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a few questions in there, so I'll try to do my best to answer them all. And if I forget one, just let me know again. So in terms of private space, it was not private space for the IPS study. Our lab efficacy studies was private space. You just kind of worked in. If you had a question, you pressed a buzzer and someone came and helped you. But for IPS, the implementers basically sat right next to the clients, and then they would get them up and running. And during that hour and 15 minutes, about 20 minutes, there was help to get the tool up and running. For the most part, the rest of the time, it was the client working on their own, using the tool, and then maybe a 10-minute debrief at the end. And then in terms of training for the employment specialists, so it's a standard about a 3.5-hour training. Typically, we do it in a group setting when we train folks. And the training is typically about an hour, 45 minutes to an hour webinar where we do a demo using a fidelity checklist to show you all the bells and whistles of the tool. And then we ask the employment specialist to spend 90 minutes using the tool themselves. And then it's go in, check out the e-learning, go in, check out the job application. And it's all just point and click. It's really easy to do. And then what's a little tricky is just getting familiar with the job interview training interface where you're talking with Molly, and that has a fidelity checklist. So you can basically check off all the bells and whistles of the tool while you're learning how to do it. And then practicing, I think it's 2 or 3 interviews with Molly yourself. And then once you practice those 2 or 3 interviews with Molly yourself, you kind of get a sense of how it works. And then what we do after that is we do either a peer-to-peer role play where an employment specialist will practice role play teaching Molly to a peer, or they can practice teaching Molly to one of the research team members. And then we use a fidelity checklist to kind of evaluate how that role play goes. And then typically after that role play, it's sort of a rubber stamp, okay, you're good to go, unless the employment specialist asks for more training time to become more familiar, but that's pretty rare that folks ask for more time. But that's about a 3.5-hour training just to teach somebody how to use the tool. And then there's an additional about an hour training. I didn't talk about it, but the tool has an administrative portal. The administrative portal is where an ES can go in and look and see how all of their clients are doing. They can it's pretty easy to link clients to a particular person through the administrative portal. But it's an easy way to go in and see how your clients are scoring, what their transcripts look like, where they need where they're still having performance limitations or challenges that they still need to work on. You can see all that through the administrative portal, so that's super helpful. And then we're still sort of developing what the technology training should look like. But that's some of those bugs in the tool have already been sort of ironed out. And because a lot of this was done 2017, 2018, 2019. So it's already been 4 years since we completed this study. And during that 4 years, the tool runs through like a Google Chrome browser, and Google Chrome is updating all the time. And so behind the scenes, the company has to continually update the usability of the tool. And so a lot of those glitches are kind of already taken care of. And then was there one other question in there that I still need to answer?
I think it was just about the affecting the content delivery of how an employment specialist might traditionally deliver interview training material, and was there any direction on how they should approach that or specific content versus just kind of integrate this into what you would normally do?
Yeah, I mean, for us, we are trying. So we monitored fidelity of IPS during the study, and doing the Molly training did not alter fidelity for IPS, which is a good thing. That being said, we are trying not to change anything. We don't want to change anything about IPS in terms of the standard IPS service that's provided. So we're not going to say, hey, if you're doing this, you should do something different. So we just see this as an add-on rather than trying to change anything.
Good.
Okay, thank you. Saida Davis, I'm going to let you, I'm unmuting you. Please feel free to ask your question.
My question was just basically, I took the supported employment specialist training a few years ago. And I just wanted to know when and where is that being offered? I would like to have a few of my staff trained in that.
Trained on supported employment or?
Yes, to be
so
supported employment specialist.
Sure. So I would recommend going to the IPS Works website. I'm actually not part of the IPS network, so I don't know when they offer their trainings and such. So I apologize for that lack of clarity in the presentation, but I actually work, my research is independent of the IPS mothership, so to speak.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
All right. This has been really wonderful. We've had lots of feedback. I just want to open it up to anybody else. Does anyone else have any questions? You can raise your hand. I see someone in the chat. Oh, that was that was a response to Saida. Somebody in the chat said that there is an IPS training on May 1st that's being offered. So thank you for sharing that information. Are there any other questions for Dr. Smith? You can raise your hand, you can chat in the chat box or the question and answer section. All right, well, I want to thank you all for coming today, taking an hour out of your day on a Friday to spend time and listen to this really exciting work. I did post a link to a survey in the chat. We are really always collecting information about these webinars so that we can craft them and adapt them so that they best meet your needs. And please stay tuned because we will be having another Making Sense of Employment Research webinar in early June, end of May, early June. So thank you so much. You feel free to email Dr. Smith or me. I'm putting my email in the chat box as well if you have any questions. And I hope you have a wonderful afternoon and a good weekend. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.